Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carrie Schleyer, and I'm the laboratory manager at Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. Welcome to this webinar that is part of the Four Corners lecture series. We're really excited to get to have this opportunity to share this great talk with you this afternoon. I first want to say a big thank you to Friends of Cedar Mesa and Bears Ears Education Center for making this possible. Many of you know that we have a Four Corners lecture series here in the Four Corners of the United States. Although this is the first time that we're doing broadcasting of these lectures across the country. So we're very excited to be able to reach a broader audience. People that have helped us do that, especially at Crow Canyon, our IT director, Dylan Schwint, and also our webinar coordinator, Taylor Hasbrook. So we want to say thank you to them for helping us get these webinars going. So I want to give you a little bit of background on how you can do these Zoom video conferencing webinars. One is that you're going to see, I think my little head is floating in the corner of your screen. You can move that box around, and if it's covering part of the slide that you want to be able to see, you can actually just move that around to wherever on your screen you'd like that to be. So please feel free to do that in case it starts to cover part of the presentation that you're wanting to see. We also really want this to be interactive, so you can ask questions within Zoom by clicking the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. Click in there and then type your question, and we'll answer as many questions as we can this afternoon. We'll try to get to all of them. If you're having difficulties with Zoom, you can head over to our live stream on Facebook, which I see is going strong, and we've got a number of people watching on there as well. And if you want to share this presentation later with someone else or watch it again, you can subscribe to the Crow Canyon YouTube channel, which is crowcanyon.org/YouTube. You can see all of the webinars that Crow Canyon has sponsored or co-sponsored, like this one with Friends of Cedar Mesa, on that YouTube channel. So I want to give you a little bit of background about Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. Our mission is to empower present and future generations by making the human past accessible and relevant through archaeological research, experiential education, and American Indian knowledge. If you want to learn more about Crow Canyon, you can go to our website at crowcanyon.org. And we really thank you for participating in these webinars that we've been hosting and helping to co-host for other organizations like Friends of Cedar Mesa, because it's allowing us to be connected during this time when many of us are sort of stuck at home. So we really appreciate that opportunity to come into your home and help us all meet our mission. Thank you so much. We have another webinar coming up next week called Digitizing the Past, Recent 3D Modeling at Crow Canyon Archaeological Center with Grant Coffey. You can register now on Crow Canyon's website or on our Facebook page. That will be Thursday, May 21st at 4 p.m. So we hope that you can make that webinar as well as this one. I'm now going to turn this over to Stephanie Wacha from Friends of Cedar Mesa, who will be the moderator and will present the talk for this afternoon. So here you go, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Carrie. Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie Wacha. I am the Education Director here at Friends of Cedar Mesa. We are a Bluff-based nonprofit conservation organization, and our mission is to work to protect and build respect for the cultural and natural landscapes of the greater Bears Ears region. And we are so pleased to be presenting Shanna, Diederichs, and Meadow, Coldon today, and so grateful for the support of Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. We are just happy to be able to keep events going during this time. Normally, these events are hosted here at the Bears Ears Education Center. We are a grassroots powered community visitor center for Bears Ears National Monument, and our mission here is to teach people to visit with respect. since a lot of people coming to visit the cultural resources of the landscape don't necessarily know how to do that. And so we are interested in protecting our resources here. Just before we get to today's talk, I want to invite you, we will be having another one coming up on May 26th with Ed Caboti. It's an alternative history of America. It's going to be on May 26th at 7 p.m. on Zoom. And if you like our Facebook page, Bears Ears Education Center, or Friends of Cedar Mesa, we will be posting the link on there. Ed has been the artist in residence at the Museum of Northern Arizona for 7 years. And this presentation has been given at the Smithsonian and the National Museum of the American Indian, as well as at the Museum of Northern Arizona. And it presents commonly held misconceptions about the history of the Americas with a particular emphasis on Indigenous history. So follow us on Facebook for that. And today is my absolute pleasure to present Shanna and Meadow and of Woods Canyon Archaeological Center. They have been working very, very closely with Friends of Cedar Mesa for the last 4 years, doing some incredible volunteer work on the landscape. And so it's the last, I think it was from 2016 to 2017 to 2019. That they were working up in Cottonwood Wash with volunteers. And in 2019 alone, there were, I think, over 3,000 volunteer hours in the field supporting this work, everything from rock imagery recording to stabilization work going on this year. And I'm really pleased to hear, looking forward to hearing what Shanna and Meadow have to say about that today. And I will be moderating questions. I think we're going to be holding them to the end, but we will try to get to all of them. So with that, here you go.
Okay, thanks. Super excited to be here. I just want to say thanks to both Friends of Cedar Mesa for inviting us to give this talk, and Crow Canyon for really supporting the Four Corner Lecture Series and getting this to happen. It's pretty exciting. I'm Shanna Diederichs. I'm the a site conservator and archaeologist over at Woods Canyon Archaeological Consultants. And I just want to let Meadow Coldon, I'm going to present today, but I'm going to let her introduce herself just real quick, and then she'll be in on questions at the end.
Hi, I'm Meadow Coldon. I've been working with Woods Canyon for 2 years doing the conservation projects and rock art documentation with volunteers, and I'll just be around for to chime in at the end with questions.
Okay. We have had a pretty fantastic run over the last couple of years. I'm obviously going to be talking about Basketmaker II rock art in Southeast Utah. And you're going to have to bear with me real quick. I'm going to share my screen. And okay, and if any of you know me, you will know that I like to pack a lot into my talk. So hold on for the ride, and I hope that you enjoy this. We certainly have enjoyed working on it over the last couple of years. So I'm going to be talking about projects in 2 different canyon systems, and that is the Indian Creek on the north side of the Abajo Mountains in southeast Utah, and Cottonwood Wash that runs to the south. So Cottonwood Wash really ties the high elevations of the Abajo Mountains to the San Juan River at Bluff. So it's about 65 miles long corridor. And then we've got Indian Creek on the north, which drains through the Needles district of Canyonlands to meet the Colorado River. So both of these are well-watered, substantial canyons that are really oases in sort of the dissected desert that is southeast Utah. And they were really important to early agricultural societies. So as Stephanie was mentioning, we've been doing quite a few projects over the last couple of years, and have focused. 2 of those have focused in Cottonwood Wash and Indian Creek. And I just wanted to say that Woods Canyon has been recording a lot of sites in Southeast Utah. We've done over 2,000 acres of survey just in those sort of areas, another 10,000 in San Juan County itself. So we've got a really good context for what's going on culturally in these two linear sort of corridors in central Southeast Utah. So these projects, the Cottonwood Wash project and the Indian Creek project, were incorporated a whole bunch of Friends of Cedar Mesa volunteers, so anywhere from 4 to 15 volunteers. We always had a Friends of Cedar Mesa staff out there, and then Meadow and I usually served as the archaeologist technical support. So we recorded 73 sites between the two canyons, and we've illustrated 81 rock art panels. As any of you that have been out there know, there is over 2,000 years of occupation visible on those panels. And today I'm going to talk about just a tiny slice of that cultural occupation. And that is the early agricultural period, basically what we call the Basketmaker II. And to do that, I am going to focus on two rock art styles. So one of those is the San Juan anthropomorphic style. This has really been, this style has been called out, described, and traced by a lot of archaeologists, but Sally Cole in particular. I bet a lot of you recognize this image in particular. It's from the Kachina panel down on the San Juan River. And it's the classic style. We've got big, broad anthropomorph with big shoulders, lot of decorative materials, so necklaces, sashes, those tablito headdresses, large hands and feet, sort of oversized hands and feet. That's the classic style, but there are a lot of different anthropomorph figures that fall into that larger style, and you'll recognize that as we get further into the talk. So the second style I want to talk about, again, I'll point to Sally Cole, who recognized this style and has been tracing it sort of over central eastern Utah, and that is what is called the Abajo LaSalle style anthropomorph. I am going to refer to that as the LaSalle style today, just so we don't get confused between the landmark of the Abajos and the style name. But as you can see, it's borrowing from multiple other styles. So it really is reminiscent of what's called the Barrier Canyon style, sort of maybe more up into the Capitol Reef area. And that's that picture over to the left. And those figures are trapezoidal again, but they almost never have arms and legs, so no appendages, and a lot of textile designs in the bodywork. So you can see this one's got stripes, there's dots, there's a lot of fringe sometimes, and those are very ethereal looking figures. Our Abajo LaSalle style is borrowing from both, seems to come from that Barrier Canyon archaic tradition, but it is also starting to incorporate some of those San Juan anthropomorph designs. So a lot more decorative, so maybe necklaces, headdresses, arms and legs are sometimes incorporated into that style. And I think that's one of the reasons that Sally recognizes that it's probably contemporary with our San Juan anthropomorph style. Really, when we think about these Basketmaker II populations in Southeast Utah, I think they are extremely important in both a cultural sense and an archaeological sense. And that's because they are what we think the source populations for some of the larger regional traditions that develop later on. So I could think of everything in the ancestral Pueblo world, if you think of traditions like the Mesa Verde tradition, the Cibola or Chaco tradition, Kayenta tradition. All of those sort of harken back to that Basketmaker II population in southeast Utah. It's been less studied how Basketmaker II relates to later Fremont traditions and up to the north in Utah. But there are several people looking at that and studying it recently. So there's a possibility that there was major influence in the Fremont direction, if not direct source populations moving into the Fremont. So I think that, what we're looking at in southeast Utah is a really important record of both sort of these formative social organizations that are related to early agriculture and probably traditions, social institutions, behaviors that are all sort of at the base of some of the belief systems for some of these later culture groups. So there's been a lot of work by a lot of rock art specialists, which I'm not, into how to interpret these Basketmaker II stylistic groups. I would say like Polly Shaftsma comes to mind. She has really put forward that those San Juan anthropomorphs, those classic styles, are representing sort of shamans in trance states. She sees that sort of as because they are in a prone position and their hands are enlarged. A lot of other people have pointed to the LaSalle style and the Barrier Canyon history behind that tradition as being also related to trance states and something, otherworldly depictions. But there's other archaeologists out there that see these more on a territorial basis. Francis Smiley and Fred Lohendorf see them more as territorial markers, and they've done GIS studies to see where they cluster in space, and they claim that they see them clustering around food caches along territorial boundaries. So that's a real possibility too. And then we've got like Sally Cole and Jane Kitchell that see these styles in more of a narrative framework. And they really point to this because they see repetition in both particular characters and in themes across space. So it's those narratives could be historical, but they could also be very mythological, related to belief systems. So as I mentioned, I am not a rock art specialist. I'm sort of cut of the mill Southwest archaeologist, and so what I do with that is we really kept those understandings of those thematic ideas in mind when we went to the field, but what our focus was on was to contextualize these rock art panels. So at the smallest scale, that really means that we are drawing those panels to scale, and you can see in some of these pictures that we were literally measuring and scaling all of our drawings. That's to capture every single element, every treatment, and whether that's even late materials that are overlaid on top of it. We also contextualize the panels within the space they were in. So I think it's really important that there are sort of immediate experiential contexts of these places, because once you've visited them, you realize that it's not about just what's on the drawing, it's about where it is in space. So we're really trying to understand where it's placed and how it relates to other panels around it, and even larger than that is the cultural landscape that it exists in. So that's a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, is sort of contextualizing these drawings in space. I think I'll start with Cottonwood Wash. Cottonwood Wash, if you've ever been there, it's a very nurturing place, is how I would put it. It's 65 miles of canyon with sort of a sandy wash bottom that would have been really perfect for early agriculture in the region. There's the Abajo Mountains on the north, San Juan River on the south, and what you're seeing that white formation to the left, that's actually Comb Ridge. So this is a photo of some of those canyon walls, and you can see it's the Cedar Mesa sandstone. Cedar Mesa sandstone is really important to Cottonwood Wash because it's a pretty malleable formation. So that means that it forms into sort of soft meanders. It's not a very linear canyon. Nice alcoves form, and we get even a lot of side canyons. So lots of ways in and out of Cottonwood Wash. I've stylized a sketch of just a mile long of Cottonwood Wash, and just so you guys understand why we did this, you know, that we're really trying to protect all location information about these places. So this is, I'm really sort of simplifying a lot of the location information as requested by the BLM. So what you're seeing is about a mile-long section of Cottonwood, and you can see how it meanders, it turns. There's lots of side canyons, and in red are the locations of the Basketmaker sites in sort of that landscape. And what you notice almost right away is that they map onto major sort of landmarks. So this massive rincon, this big arced rincon, has over 200 meters of rock art covering it. We've got this central fin that sticks out towards the rincon, and quite a bit of Basketmaker II rock art on that fin, and then down in that southern alcove that's sort of tucked up a side canyon. I do want to say right here that we did not find any of the LaSalle style anthropomorphs in Cottonwood Wash. These are all the San Juan anthropomorph style figures. So it is dominated by that San Juan style. As Sally Cole has pointed out, really that LaSalle style doesn't start until north of the Abajo Mountains. So these panels were extensive, like I said, really complex, complicated. But when you step back and you sort of look at them, you can see that there's a little bit of repetition that goes on, and that they sort of fall into these major themes. And I'll give examples of each of those, but you can see that I've sort of generalized these themes, and I call them like female, male, and action panels. And with that, places like that rincon on the north side, you can see that they're fairly gendered places. Like we've got large female panels on the south side, male panels to the north, and sort of these action panels in between. So when I start talking about gender, of course, we've all have to be pretty wary. Gender, of course, it's really a cultural and social construct rather than just a biological fact. So we have to be careful not to push sort of gender stuff onto the past, especially when we're talking 2,000-year old imagery. Really lucky for me is that there are some incredible researchers that have worked to identify gender markers in San Juan anthropomorph style rock art. there are the obvious gender links, such as genitalia or breasts, evidence of pregnancy, or copulation imagery. Those have all been used to help us sort of tease out gender perspectives. But we also have evidence in the material culture itself. So we've got what we call menstrual aprons, and over in the left-hand photo, we have an image of these from Lori Webster's Cedar Mesa Perishables project. And Lori's a textile expert, and what she's found is that these menstrual aprons appear in Basketmaker II artifact collections on a regular basis. So we know that they were in use. We know that they were worn by women. So we know that depictions with those menstrual aprons can be pretty that we can probably attribute those to a female gender. On a purely cultural gender indicator, has really been found in ethnographic accounts. And the most famous is the butterfly hair whirl image that you see on the right there. And these were worn traditionally by marriageable age women at Hopi. And Kelly Hayes Gilpin has demonstrated that hair whirls imagery has been depicted for over 2,000 years in ancestral Pueblo sites. So that's both in rock art, on pottery, and she really traces it all the way back to the Basketmaker II period. So again, sort of a gender connected, but in much more of a cultural context. Sally Cole has noted that male figures are really the only figures, it looks like, that are associated with bows and arrows, and they are generally the San Juan anthropomorph styles that wear the tablito headdresses. So with all this information, we were really able to recognize gender when it was shown in Cottonwood Canyon San Juan anthropomorph figures. So the two largest panels that we have in Cottonwood Canyon, at least this section of Cottonwood Canyon, are that female theme. So I call them assemblies of women. So these were female figures that were pegged, incised, painted, and they have everything from eyebrows, eyes, mouths, necklaces, belly buttons, breasts, almost always those menstrual aprons and sashes. And, you get the crying figures too. So you get the lines coming down from the face on a lot of the female figures. Few of them have limbs, and they're really depicted in these very expansive panels. So we had panels that were up to 25 women in a row, covering up to 50 meters of a canyon wall. And standing in front of them, you really get a sense of sort of standing in front of an assembly or a formation of women. Nearly all of the figures were bare-chested, except in the right lower corner, I give sort of an example of some of the women look like they were maybe covered in mantas or blankets over the chest. As I said, almost every single one of them wore those menstrual aprons, but there was only one of them that was wearing hair whirls. So, take it for what it's worth. But if we really push that ethnographic information back into the past, we could say that these panels are depicting assemblies of women, of married, especially of married women of birthing age. And that's a really substantial, powerful symbol for an early agricultural society. So pretty interesting stuff. In a few panels, we've got small groups of usually men, 2 to 5 people at a time, with a lot of floating symbology around them. And they're often wearing what we think are masks because the faces are heavily pecked or ground out. So they're almost darkened compared to the rest of the figure. These males in mask themed panels seem to occur along transit routes, so ways in and out of the canyon and sort of these overlook places, so not necessarily interacting as much with other panels. And then there is what I just simply had to call the action theme panel. These are far more complex with both unique and sort of standard imagery all mixed into them. And there are, we have men and women in these action panels, and they're usually in relation to each other. So you can see those three figures in the middle. It looks like maybe they're men and women holding hands. And then we've got dots off to the right-hand side from the figure on the right to a head. So a head or even maybe possibly a scalp bag. And that looks like it's been detached from a body below it. So there is quite a bit of violence depiction, or at least heads or scalp bags depicted in those action panels too. So I just wanted to give one more example of an action panel, I think. You can see a couple holding hands over to the left, and then other figures, possibly another one holding one of those head bags. And these are sort of enhanced photos. This was a painted version of an action panel, so you can kind of get a sense of what those look like in real life. So Cottonwood Wash, really just the shape of the canyon itself sort of forms different experiences of this rock art. And I think that there was very big emphasis on sort of public spaces versus private spaces and things that are in between. And scale and location really had to play into that. So if you think about what would be a public venue, it's something that's very, very visible from far away. And actually, I think that image up on the left is the true scale of one of those female figures in the Rincon. So that sort of that big public space up on the north end of the study area. So that was almost 2.5 meters tall. And that is just the torso of the woman, you have to remember. So these are over life-size depictions. While there's much more of a private setting in what I would call that alcove site down to the south, where you almost have to get within feet of the figures to see them. So you have to get very close to them. So it's a much more private experience. Talking about that private experience, it was almost a more intimate experience when they created these images. A lot of the times the rock behind the figure was ground even in preparation. There's all sorts of different technology that's used. So they're grinding, incising, pecking, painting, sort of doing this almost relief look to create the images. So it's a very personal experience even creating those private setting images. And I will point out, I think the photo I have here is the one female with the hair whorls. You can see those sort of packed to either side of the head. So thinking about these public and private spaces, they're very distinct. Even though we've got the same kind of imagery in all sorts of different settings, those experiences are very, very different. So like back to that Rincon, we're talking about 200-meter arched Rincon facing an open space where hundreds of people could have fit. And I think Kelly Hayes Gilpin has really referred to spaces like this as sort of macro social venues, and places exactly like this rincon would have been important for early agricultural societies. If you think about getting multiple tribes together, maybe that have territorial tensions even, you could sort of work through those tensions through all sorts of things in a large group space. So maybe it was even through feasting, ritual, dance, exchange of marriage partners, political maneuvering. All of those could have happened in these macro social spaces. The fin itself is interesting because there's a lot of habitation all the way around that fin where people were living. So the rock art, that San Juan rock art that was there, would have been very accessible. You would have constantly been sort of experiencing that rock art on a daily basis. And then, of course, we've got the Alco site, which is related to a lot of storage, but it doesn't look like it would have been, it didn't have as large of occupation for that Basketmaker II period. So I've got a quote from Sally Cole up here. But for me, what I really come away thinking about is that we've got repetitions of themes, maybe even repetitions of particular characters, and they're presented in both public, accessible, and private spaces, just in this 1 mile section of Cottonwood Wash. And what that says to me is that we really have sort of a narrative tradition that's being repeated over and over in this location. I just think it's probably, it fits that model of what Sally Cole and Jane Kitchell have talked about for sort of narrative behavior. This definitely doesn't say that themes of trans-state or territorial boundary stuff, that those don't come into play. They might even play into those larger narratives, but it certainly looks like we've got a narrative tradition in the San Juan anthropomorphs in Cottonwood. I'm going to give you one tiny example of sort of that repetition that we started to parse out in the canyon, and it's this one lone 3 or maybe 2-digit figure. We recorded it 5 different times on different panels, and it is always over to the left of the action, kind of above or below it, as if it's watching it from the side. So there's this one figure, if we start to conceive of this as an identifiable character in Basketmaker II narratives, then we can start asking more anthropological questions out of this rock art. That's kind of where I'm headed with some of this. If you're interested in the repetition, I don't torture yourself with this table, but this is just to show you some of the other elements and figures that we started seeing repeated in just that one section of Cottonwood Canyon. And even the unique sort of elements that were recorded in Cottonwood, such as lobed head individuals, sort of twin motifs, moon elements. All of those have been reported for San Juan anthropomorph panels across the larger region. So I just think that we've got sort of larger historical or mythological depictions going on in San Juan style. So going to the north side, completely flipping over to Indian Creek. Does any of this hold for the panels in Indian Creek? Indian Creek is a very different place in some ways. I mean, it's almost as long as Cottonwood Wash. It's about 50 miles long, and it connects the Abajo Mountains, like I said, down to that Colorado River corridor. It would have been very important for populations moving along that Colorado River corridor to reach the high country of the Abajos. It would have just been the most obvious route up to that high country. And you can see from the photo on the left, there is really prime agricultural, sort of that floodwater agricultural land in Indian Creek, especially in central Indian Creek. But it has its differences too. And part of that is I think the rock is to blame. Indian Creek flows through the Wingate Formation, and climbers, Indian Creek is a mecca for climbers because of that Wingate Formation. It's very hard. It forms these nice, beautiful cracks, pinnacles, and faces, really steep faces, but it doesn't leave a lot of access routes in and out of the canyon, and it drops off into the Entrada Formation below it. And you can see that in this photo where you've got sort of that rubbly scree below the nice Wingate face. And that leaves the lower portions of Indian Creek walls not very habitable. So there's just no good alcoves that form in that Wingate material. There's not a lot of springs. So you're really dependent on the creek itself and when that's flowing. And the agricultural zone is pretty short because Indian Creek drops into sort of dissected bedrock country in the lower portions. So yes, it is a prime agricultural spot for early agriculturalists, but it's just not quite as sweet as Cottonwood is. The other thing I should say is that Indian Creek, because it's that connection between the Colorado and the Abajo Mountains, it draws not only people, but a lot of wildlife into it. And I think that was important for its history for at least the last 2,000 to 4,000 years. And I think you'll see that in the rock art. So this is a comparable section of Indian Creek, about a mile-long section. And we've got a lot of rock art, just probably as dense as Cottonwood, if not more dense in Indian Creek. But you can see that it is broken up between the San Juan style and the La Salle style. So we've got both of those anthropomorphic styles depicted in Indian Creek, but they seem to be placed in locations where they don't overlap very much. I think out of the something like 50 panels down that direction, only one of them had both San Juan style and La Salle style on the same panel. So it's very rare that they were depicted on the same place. You could make an argument that is another sign that both those culture groups, whoever is making those, are using that canyon at the same time, and there's this sort of mutual avoidance of each other's spaces. The La Salle style anthropomorphs are really isolated around those fins. So you can see the northern fin in particular, and the panel north of that, and then along portions of that southern fin. While the San Juan anthropomorphs are sort of on these small, isolated panels way up the scree slope, usually fairly visible, but sort of sporadically spread out down the canyon, and then, of course, on that southern fin. So the San Juan anthropomorph style, I just threw out a lot of patterns that we saw in Cottonwood in particular. And a lot of those have to do about repetition. Are we seeing elements repeated? Are we seeing themes repeated? And that being a real characteristic of that San Juan style. I would have to say that we found that again in Indian Creek. When we found those San Juan style anthropomorphs, they were repetitions of what we had already seen in Cottonwood in particular. This is a illustration of a panel that I bet almost everyone on this lecture is familiar with, but you're not going to recognize it in its current form. So this is newspaper rock, but it is newspaper rock with all of the proto-historic, so the Ute and Numic elements pulled off of it. So it is just the prehistoric components. And there's Archaic and Fremont, like before and after the Basketmaker II phase, but there's also Basketmaker II elements on this panel, like sort of the twins are in there. We've got some other individuals and symbols that are repeated from what we saw in Cottonwood. And I will point out, we've got our little free floating 2 to 3 fingered or toed character over on the left-hand side, right where he's supposed to be, sort of off away from the rest of the panel, watching it from the distance. So yeah, San Juan style definitely has that same sensibility of narrative that it did in Cottonwood Canyon. But some of the themes have changed. If you look at this map, you will see that sort of those women in formation, those female panels, are absolutely missing. We just don't get any of those depictions in Indian Creek. They fall away completely. And really, we only have one of the men in masks theme panels in the San Juan anthropomorph style. Instead, what we've got is San Juan anthropomorphs sort of tied into what I call hunting action panels. And a lot of times those are multi-component, so a lot of different age, depth, lots of different people over time on those same panels. And I'll get into those in a minute. And the other thing I want to point out before I move away from this is that we've got this new theme called sort of ungendered figures in procession. And those really map onto where we see the LaSalle style anthropomorphic figures. So this is to give you, so I'm jumping back to that San Juan style and to show you what those multi-component hunting panels really look like. So we've got these massive sheep. So these bighorn sheep, these are depicted at literally life size. They date to the Archaic period. So Sally Cole and her team of Earthwatch folks did quite a bit of work in Indian Creek, and we built off of a lot of that. And what Sally was able to point out is that these large sheep probably predate anything else that we're seeing in Indian Creek. So when we get to the Basketmaker period, these early agriculturalists, they are adding their elements to this already hunting sort of themed panel. And you can see there's a San Juan anthropomorph guy over to the left a little bit. And then those striped, that striped kind of symbol with the loop on the top, that's a very common Basketmaker II San Juan anthropomorph symbol, probably of a bag, like a twined and sort of braided bag. So we've got them adding themselves into these hunting themed panels. And they're not the only ones. I just wanted to show this panel because it shows sort of the time depth that we're looking at. We've got one of those huge Archaic bighorn sheep, and then way to the left might be one of our little San Juan anthropomorph figures. But then we see the groups like the Fremont, Ancestral Pueblo, and then even into the Ute period. So all these later traditions are layering on their figures onto this big hunting themed panel. So there's something about that. It seems like there's for 2,000, maybe even 4,000 years, people are moving through Indian Creek and adding themselves into these hunting themed panels. The LaSalle style figures in Indian Creek are very different. There's almost no later or earlier elements on those panels at all. They all were created, sort of rendered in one time or one event. And they sort of depict even one event. So these are what I call the ungendered figures in procession. And what you can see over to the right, that drawing on the right really shows sort of what you get when you're looking at sort of the scale of in these depictions. So you get really large figures, maybe smaller figures. They get even smaller. You know, this group is holding hands. And then you get almost this stylized symbology of people in a line with that line below and sort of sashes coming down it. I see that as, you know, is this scale of procession or even people further away or closer in that you're seeing in sort of that procession. And that's same for that photo on the left where you get the couple and then you've got sort of these squiggly lines but dashes. Is that symbolism of sort of this movement like it is in that other panel? The experience, just like sort of the themes, are different in Indian Creek than they are in Cottonwood. We have still sort of those public, what I would argue for as public places, private experience panels, and sort of accessible locations. And as you can see sort of from the map, we've got the accessible panels are in the blue color, and they sort of flank the one habitation site that we recorded that dates to the Basketmaker II period. So this is a really large habitation site, and it seems to be flanked by some accessible panels. And if you remember, that's also the location where we've got the dominance of the LaSalle style anthropomorphs is up on that northern fin. So possibly do we have actual long-term committed habitation and agriculture by that LaSalle style group. The public panels in this section of Indian Creek are different in that they don't create that macro social venue at all. So that big rincon up in the north, it's almost devoid of rock art. We don't get evidence of large groups of people with imagery around them gathering. Instead, the public panels are really visible from the canyon floor. If you're walking down that canyon, you can see them, but they're usually fairly isolated. They're large figures in sort of a public space where you can see them, but they're not expansive by any means. And in Indian Creek, we've got this really interesting phenomena where we've got a public-private sort of connection and interface between panels. So that means very public panels that sort of point to and lead you to private experiential panels. Let me give you an example. So this picture is Janet Leverwood sitting on a ledge on that northern point, so that northern fin that we've been talking about. What you can see is you've got Indian Creek in the background, and that is probably like the bottom of the creek is close to at least 100 feet below her. So she is sitting on this tiny point way up a cliff face, and that crack, that little innocuous crack next to her, is is where you have to find your public panel. So if you were standing at the bottom of the cliff in the wash and looking up that crack, you would see the depiction of this figure that we've got a drawing of up on the left. So it's the only place that you can see sort of this publicly framed panel. What's interesting, to get to where Janet Leverwood is sitting, you have to leave that viewing point, walk around that fin, climb up this very steep scree slope, then make your way up a cliff band, walk out onto an exposed face where you just have a tiny ledge for about 20 meters to get around to this point. But when you get there, when you finally made the effort and got all the way to that point, what you would see is this beautiful crack with at least 4 panels inside of it. So it's a very different kind of private space. It's not because the private is small in scale and personable. It's private because it is absolutely difficult to get to, and you really can't fit more than a couple people in that space to see it. So you've got a public panel that is visible from the canyon bottom, and what that leads you to is a private experience of these processions, if you will. So here are some of the panels that are inside that 10-meter deep crack, way up on the cliff face. And over to the right, you see the flute players and the guys in the headdress. Those are the deepest characters in the crack. So they are deep inside that crack. And then you've got sort of that procession with in the center with the big figures. Some of them get legs, some of them are holding hands, and sort of that dot or dashed line of possibly more figures in sort of smaller scale. And at the left, you've got this expansive figure overlooking really different sort of anthropomorphs, people with like feet and headdresses and toes, much more sort of human looking figures, in sort of almost, there's dots coming down from above, is this sort of a celebration looking aspect. So there's different sort of themes on these very private panels. So, you know, when I think about both the LaSalle style and the San Juan style, I feel like they are, there is this element of narratives being told, but those narratives seem to be very different. You know, in the San Juan style, it's these layered, repeated, sort of scaled narratives, where when we see at least the LaSalle style figures in and panels in Indian Creek, they're almost these, they're a singular story. They're very clear story of one event that's going on. You know, I could get some flack for putting some of that out there, but it does force me to think about what kind of narratives they might be telling. And here's where I really step out on a limb, but I think sometimes when we contextualize panels and their association to each other, we actually do get sort of an understanding of what they might be getting at. In the San Juan style, when we start thinking about how panels relate to each other, what we've seen, and it was not just in Cottonwood, but over and over again, there's sort of this horizontal layering that happens in San Juan style. So this is that alcove that I was talking about, and the Basketmaker II people that depicted their rock art in here, they used a linear line. So this sort of pigment line in the back of the alcove, this natural layer to build off of. And below that line, there are a few characters, but they are not really of human form. There are a lot of amorphous looking, they're not quite of this world. Where above it, you get one of those expansive female assemblies. And then layered above that is sort of action panels with all these handprints and people, men and women in relationship to each other. And get one of those males in mask panels that leads up this arch up to the uppermost panel, and again sort of one of those massive action panels. So when I look at this and I think about sort of narratives, it reminds me of sort of layered cosmologies. And this is something we work with when we think about associated or culturally affiliated Native people in the region. This is very important and foundational to their belief systems. So I think about Hopi and Zuni and Acoma and the northern Rio Grande tribes, and even some clans of the Navajo. It's all about emergence from lower worlds. So in the Hopi story, it's all about coming up through multiple worlds that were destroyed because people couldn't get their head around honoring the true way of living. So maybe there was greed or gambling, but they are constantly progressing up into what we call the fourth world, which is the world we live in now. So I think even just looking at sort of context of these rock art panels can kind of help us understand how what they're trying to express in a larger picture. When I look at the LaSalle style, it's very different. None of it is horizontal layering at all. In fact, it's all relational to those vertical cracks, almost to these windows to another world, to these very special places. I don't want to step into origin stories of Numic people, because I'd really be walking on thin ice, I think, if I went there. But these are very profound differences in relationship to the landscape that these panels are depicted in. So when I think about comparisons, and again, the argument has been made that the San Juan style and the LaSalle style really represent different cultural groups, maybe even different ethnicities that were practicing agriculture at the same time during the Basketmaker II period. But when I start to look at their rock art and what that really shows us, I think I could boil it down to, the San Juan style sort of has these mythological or historical narratives that keep being repeated. They're very focused on social gatherings in particular. Gender roles are highly emphasized, and there's an idea of sort of layered cosmology or layered horizontal worlds. The LaSalle style, on the other hand, is much more about singular stories, sort of migration, celebration, and they're more of these relationally, they're windows through cracks in the landscape. So maybe these are very different people or approaching the idea of settling down into agriculture with very different social templates. And here, I'm really going to digress. I don't know how we're doing on time. Are we doing okay? Yeah, okay. But I don't delve into ideas of depictions of cosmology and gender roles. I don't do that because I think that I can interpret the rock art. In fact, I would probably argue that no rock art study is going to be able to do that. But I think it's important to contextualize as much information as we can so that we can give it to the people that can talk about and interpret this imagery. So I think Basketmaker II affiliation studies are really important for our Native tribal groups today. And that is, we're talking about an area where most of them don't live anymore. But the people claiming affiliation to these areas, can they see themselves in this 2,000-year-old imagery or connect with it in some way? Do they find some affiliation themselves? And this really struck me. I didn't take this very seriously until we were drawing one of those big female panels in Cottonwood Canyon, and I saw at the very end of the panel was this historic Ute dress, so just depicted in line with all of the other women. So metaphorically, here is this lineup of Basketmaker II women, this very powerful symbology, and we've got maybe it was actually a woman who depicted her Ute dress in that lineup itself. Both of these canyons, Cottonwood Canyon and Indian Creek, were well-known territory for the Ute for several centuries. And in that bottom drawing, you can see that we've got just amazing Ute rock art in these canyons. A warrior on one side, a couple with a flat hat on the other side. But it touched me when I started reading about what Steve Sims, who he's a retired professor, but he's a Fremont archaeologist in the Fremont area, and he's really argued that we have, as archaeologists, that we have really dislocated Fremont from possibly their deep roots on the Colorado Plateau. And some of that is because at several different stages, we've sort of broken apart past cultural groups. So that could be the Basketmaker II. We haven't really connected to later agricultural groups like the Fremont, and we've really broken the Ute away from possible connections with the Fremont. So I'd like to throw some ideas out there of things that we should be thinking about when it comes to cultural affiliation studies in the future. And one of those is that our Basketmaker II populations could have easily been source population groups for the Fremont. We see that in their agricultural patterns. We see that in their pottery or their pottery developments later on down the line. And we see that in their rock art. This is a drawing of a panel in Indian Creek, and all of the figures that you're looking at date to the Fremont period. They are all fall within the Fremont style of rock art. But yeah, when you stare at the figures on the left, can you see that connection with that LaSalle style? Not a lot of appendages depicted, but we've got some elements of jewelry, sort of that barrier canyon style coming through that Fremont rock art. And the images on the right, what is that influence of San Juan anthropomorph style, where there's jewelry, the crying lines, sort of the trapezoidal body types. I think there is a very strong argument that Basketmaker II people in the San Juan and Colorado River corridors were direct source populations for at least some of the Fremont culture groups, especially when you start looking up into the Dinosaur National Monument area. The rock art is almost a direct derivative of what you see in the Basketmaker II down in southeast Utah. And then the other connection that has really that archaeologists have argued for is that there's no way that the Ute derived from the Fremont, because the Fremont were an agricultural tradition. They farmed all over, especially Utah and into Colorado, but the Ute are a nomadic population. When we start looking at the 1200s and 1300s, when the Fremont supposedly disappeared, that was tough times, not only in the Southwest, but across North America. I mean, populations, long-standing societies were dissolving, reorganizing, taking up other lifeways. Why can't there be a possibility that Uto-Aztecan groups like the Ute actually turned back to hunting and gathering lifeways for the most part, instead of being committed agriculturists like the Fremont were? So there's larger arguments that I think that sometimes rock art can be really informative when it comes to it. One thing I will point out, so I should go back real quick. Again, this is newspaper rock. This is the version that we're all comfortable with all of the Ute depictions layered onto the prehistoric elements. You can see that there's a lot of skins, there's horses, there's guys with bows and arrows. There's a lot of Ute sort of style rock art on here. But it's one of those moments, again, when you look at these two Ute figures, big guys with horned headdresses, and you look at the Fremont figure up above them. So they are not, are they just influenced by that Fremont figure, or do they feel connected to that tradition? Is it part of their tradition, that sort of style and depiction? So these probably are hundreds of years apart, these elements that were created. So at least the people in Indian Creek, the Utes that were in Indian Creek, felt very connected to those Fremont folks in the past. So I just would leave it at that I think we need to consider rock art, not just material culture and architectural layout when it comes to cultural affiliation studies. And it would really behoove us to talk to all of our Native communities when we're looking into that deep history, especially when it goes as far back as the Basketmaker II period. Thanks. Yeah, okay. I think that I covered that pretty darn quickly. I'll turn it over to Stephanie. I think she's going to be our moderator when it comes to any questions, and I will stop sharing this so that we can see each other more clearly.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shanna. Everybody's clapping at home. That was great. Yay. Okay, so we have a lot of really great questions here. And the first, I'm going to try and lump them together by theme. We have a couple methodology questions, so I'm going to turn these over to Meadow. Steve Hinch wants to know, why do you draw the panels instead of photographing them? It seems photography would be more accurate. And then William Rudolph also wants to know, why are some of the lines on the illustrations lighter than others?
Sure. I think they're both actually pretty related questions. So one reason why we draw them instead of photograph is because, especially with the repatination of the older petroglyphs at certain times of day, it's just really hard to see them in certain lighting. So the illustrations not only allow us to look really closely and to get a more informative finished product, but also to layer time periods and techniques, so that way we can turn them on and off, kind of like some of the slides that Shanna was showing, and we can really interpret them separately as well as together. And the reason why some of them are different colors or different shades is just to represent the pecking or abrasion or just different techniques like that.
Thank you so much. And then moving back into Cottonwood, Jane Stone wants to know: have any sound studies been done in the Rincon? I think she's talking about acoustics, maybe. And in a related, Virginia Wolf wants to know if there have been any dance plazas or circles found in Cottonwood.
No, there haven't been any dance plazas recorded in Cottonwood. Virginia Wolf, I would tell her that there are later in time, so Basketmaker III, there are some really large plazas, but I wouldn't call any of the Basketmaker II sites having plazas in particular. And the acoustics is absolutely something that I would love to follow up on. Both alcoves and sort of that Rincon area, it would be tremendous. I think that, even Meadow and I have, walking by, we've played with the echo devices that are going on in that Rincon. It's a pretty incredible experience. I could, especially with singing and dancing, I think you would get a really reverberative experience right there.
Thank you. And then related to repetition, Judy would like to know: have you been able to identify if particular artists created in only one site or in multiple sites?
Gosh, I wish I could say. And again, that's probably for a true rock art specialist. And because we've got painted elements in both of these canyons, I think that's where that would really show up, is if you could really look into the fine detail techniques that are going on those panels. You might be able to identify those particular artists I would say that the LaSalle stuff looks like it's far more consistent than what we see in the San Juan anthropomorphs.
Thank you. And William Mullen, this is also a question about artists. The uniformity and repetition of a style seems to indicate that only certain individuals in a culture were allowed to practice a rock art, perhaps certain religious leaders. Is that a sensible conclusion?
I don't know. I think it's interesting. Meadow, you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I don't know. That's kind of hard to say.
Yeah, I do feel like I've had those thoughts, especially when we were recording like the very small female figures and all that intricacy that was involved with them. You do have that feeling like it's not just a pecked image that follows very standard shapes. There's a lot of technique you have to have on top of just creating a big broad image. So it's almost like this social learned pattern.
And some of the handprints that we recorded were layered on top of each other, all different sizes. And it makes you wonder if that's the same individual over time, or if that's like a family group or something like that.
Yeah, like a child growing up, putting their hands up.
Yeah, I don't know.
A lot of space for speculation.
Yeah.
A couple more concrete questions. Kathleen Wire wants to know what the green pigment was in the LaSalle style slide.
That's a good question. My guess would be it was some copper-derived mineral, which there is a lot of malachite and azurite up in that region, especially up in the Lisbon Valley. That's where you get like sort of those azurite nodules that come out.
And Steve Hinch would like to know if pictographs or petroglyphs are more prevalent, and if there's any significance to why they would do one versus the other.
Meadow, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely seen evidence of them being used together in the same elements. So you'll have some parts of them are pecked and some parts of them are painted. And I mean, I think pictographs seem to be more prevalent, but that's also the longest lasting. So yeah, I mean, I think that it's probably safe to assume that a lot of things that we see that are petroglyphs also had elements of pictographs and paint and materials used around them like that.
Thank you. Okay, let's see. Thomas Root has a question about contextualizing within the space. He says, I appreciate your description of how rock formations, for example, contextualizes local rock art. At a broader level, how does the geography of an area, such as Indian Creek versus Cottonwood Canyon, or even broader areas like Mesa Verde versus Dinosaur versus sites in New Mexico, contextualize the art also? Specifically, is there a sense of those geographical places obvious in the rock art there?
Wait, say that last one more time.
Is there a sense of those geographical places obvious in the rock art there?
Oh gosh, you know, there's a lot of people thinking about this, and I would say absolutely yes. And there's I'm thinking about the archaeology of doings in particular, and there, we recording them now, especially archaeologists, we approach rock art as this image to be captured. But there is a lot of argument that what people are doing there is actually interacting with that place. It's a lot more about that setting, that location, what it's looking at, or even the activity that you're performing while you're there, even the act of creating it. So yeah, I would say absolutely. There's so many things that funnel into what that rock art, the final rock art looks like. But I think sort of that contextual space and in a cultural context too, what that space pulls up for certain people is really important. I think that could be argued for just about any panel we ever saw.
Interesting. From Janet Leverwood. Hi, Janet. She says, hello. And as a recorder and artist, do you consider the art making itself and how change in forms is not about style, but about individual expression? She's looking for more of a discussion of rock art through the lens of artistic convention, as well as images and motifs that run through all periods, maybe as a kind of language.
I think, and what was really helpful for me is to have people like Janet Leverwood, who are professional artists, coming out with us as volunteers through Friends of Cedar Mesa, and that I think it's really great to get out of our archaeology boxes sometimes, and to get that concept of how an artist approaches sort of something as a technique or an expression, where they can see that there's a twist on sort of your standard techniques or what you're developing. I love it, and I think it's fantastic. I think there's a lot of work to do. We never found any materials. I mean, we were always looking for pecking stones, grinding materials, minerals for painting. We never found any actual production material on those surveys. But she would probably, it's one of those where I wish I could bring Janet in for that discussion. It's a place where she could really contribute. Yeah. Thanks.
Great, thank you. We have so many, so I'm sorry if we don't get to all of them. Getting close to 5 o'clock, so we'll get some concrete ones. Let's see, outside of Indian Creek, how large of an area does the LaSalle style cover?
I believe Sally has traced it all the way up through the Moab area, so up into Salt Creek in particular, and then all the way you get versions of it all the way over towards the Henrys, so Capitol Reef area. So it's not. Oh, and this gets me excited, but the lower Dolores River So you think about sort of Disappointment Valley or Paradox Valley, and you've got LaSalle figures over there. So you're really pushing the boundary of what we feel comfortable with is like where the ancestral Pueblo world or Fremont world was. These are landscapes that would have been filled with archaic sort of populations.
That is the perfect segue into two other questions. So Steve Hinch wants to know, he says there's a controversy about how old the archaic period is. Some archaeologists say it is a few thousand years old, others say it is contemporaneous with Basketmaker II. What's your opinion?
I think it's getting interesting out there. There's a lot of people. I will bring up Steve Sims again. He has done some dating on the Great Gallery, which is in Canyonlands, and that is all Barrier Canyon style. And so he's been doing optical luminescence dating and found that it is much more recent than we've ever thought. So all of these people that we've pushed way into the deep past as far as archaic goes, like, oh, they're probably, it's 7,000 years ago. We could be getting a lot of expression of people that were living a lot more contemporaneously than we had previously thought, which is very cool, I think.
Well, Fremont adopted agriculture. Were they still steadfast in hunter-gatherer ways as related to Basketmaker II lifeways?
I would say that, Basketmaker II folks were pretty darn committed. Bill Life and R.G. Matson would attest to that. Like, they're committed to agriculture and their corn. But yeah, it just depends. Fremont is a big word. It covers a really large place. And in some places, like when you look at the pueblos that are up by Salt Lake, they were doing a lot more hunting and gathering. They had water resources that were not available down south. So there's always farming in Fremont society, but I would say place and time, it sort of changes with the scale of investment.
And I think just our last one, because we're creeping up on it, if you could recommend books that depict photos and or illustrations of some rock art examples, if there's anything you like in particular.
I should have grabbed some of mine. I know that Sally Cole is working on her new images in stone, and hopefully that will be coming out in the next couple years, which is fantastic. There's a 9-mile canyon rock art sort of monograph that is really fantastic. And one, I will give a plug to what are they? They're the McElmo Farm Bed and Breakfast. These guys, they have a beautiful monograph out that is rock art all over the Southwest that they really are not trying to sell so much, but it's just a really gorgeous book. So I'd say, we have to get out of the trying to understand it sometimes and just absolutely enjoying it. We're very lucky to live in a place with this much imagery. It's awesome.
We really are. I want to apologize to everybody. A lot of comments coming in. Everybody's very happy and inspired by the conversation. So Shanna and Meadow, thank you so much for sharing your work and your knowledge with us today. It's an inspiration to really get out there and understand and just appreciate the world we live in. And thank you so much to Crow Canyon for hosting us today. And thank you to everybody for joining us.
Okay. All right. Thanks so much. Have a great summer, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.